active quarantine spots with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
The stash wonder. It's like something from Super Troopers. And chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Nice poster on this week's program. Paul O'Connell, activist, organizer, academic in the UK. We're talking about the labor leaks, what they reveal about power, the path forward, how COVID is impacting the entire European project, Labor's new leader, and transatlantic lessons for a defeated left and how it could possibly revive itself. We know it must revive. Of course, got a gem. What do we got on the gem, David?
Oh, we got the new oil cartel and the collapse of finance.
That's right. Other light stuff. Barack Obama emerges. We're going to do an analysis of his endorsement of Joe Biden. Talk about Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in the post game. And then, of course, the great Slavoj Zizek is with us. We already recorded this interview just about 48 hours ago. Fantastic. What is wartime communism? Are we about to enter into emergency communism? And why he wants communism with Julian Assange, all that and more with the ever dynamic and insightful Slavoj Zizek. And then on the post game, of course, we're talking about how your boss is spying on you. Where does tyranny really come from? Is it private or public? With Ben Burgess, Rebel Music History with Joshua Kahn Russell on Fela Kuti. And we're looking at Donald Trump claiming to have complete authority. What's that about? Cornel West, throwback on prophetic spirituality on our time. The Caribbean continues to resist as U.S. policies make Haiti uniquely vulnerable to corona, and the United States, how it demolished Brazilian democracy again. Israel holding 2 million people inside a corona outbreak zone. And we're going to be discussing a peer-to-peer model for reviving the commons as part of an overall integrated strategic approach to a post-corona world, even as Richard Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, suggests that COVID won't change our world. It will merely accelerate trends that were already in play. All that and much, much more on this week's Michael Brooks Show. So in a few minutes, we're going to get to Barack Obama's endorsement of Joe Biden and where we stand. But first, we're going to talk about something that we'll talk about with Paul O'Connell, which are these devastating leaks coming out of the UK showing a relentless campaign against Jeremy Corbyn and the left of Labour inside the Labour Party itself. Now, in some respects, this is not a surprise. This is sort of analogous. Would it surprise anyone if we found out that Democratic Party officials were coordinating with some MSNBC hosts to demonize Bernie Sanders, to smear and defame his supporters? We saw it play out in front of us every day during this cycle. And we knew that the war against Jeremy Corbyn was not only a prototype for the war against Bernie Sanders, but that it included aggressive PR efforts, relentless media bias, and the active engagement, in my view, undoubtedly, of at least some intelligence services. But we found out some stunning things, like the hype about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was, of course, where it was actually real, selectively applied, not really a good faith effort to deal with what actual anti-Semitism there was, which manifested across party sort of factions in very small ways. Apparently, the complaints about anti-Semitism, half of which came from one singular individual. And we also saw from these messages that in 2017, an extraordinary run that Jeremy Corbyn became within a couple thousand votes of winning on an incredibly brave policy platform and extraordinary grassroots enthusiasm, a campaign that would be saving countless lives right now if there was a Corbyn government, and might have had global implications for reviving social democracy and overturning neoliberalism and authoritarianism. That the labor right was literally inside the campaign's itself actively undermining Corbyn and the grassroots' efforts in full view, trying to make their own side lose. Leaked WhatsApp conversations, and these are thanks to the incredible reporting of Aaron Bastani and Navarra Media. Leaked WhatsApp messages show that members of Labour's senior management team were openly cheering for Labour's losses and were prepping Tom Watson, then Jeremy Corbyn's deputy, to be the interim leader. This group of Labour officials created, quote, secret key seat teams without the knowledge of Corbyn. It funneled money to key members of the anti-Corbyn faction, most of them in safe districts instead of competitive races. As Labour rose in the polls, members of this WhatsApp group were appalled at their party's own success. I actually felt quite sick when I saw that YouGov poll last night, one said. Labour's head of political strategy called Corbyn a lying little toe rag. And of course, they mocked Diane Abbott, who was subject to racist and sexist abuse. They even went so far as to hoping that the police would shut down a major rally before the election, with one of the members hoping that the police would, quote, use water cannons, please. What went into the campaign to the, and this was not just them being despicable sociopaths. This, again, was very material. Key data from party members and those working with Corbyn from key were withheld. Insights could have helped guide Corbyn to the additional 2,277 votes that would have made the difference in Labour forming a government. It worked to direct funds to anti-Corbyn seats, even though they were safe, as I mentioned earlier, and showed up to work and deliberately did nothing. Maybe the only way in which they were respecting any sort of honorable Labour tradition. But all jokes aside, this really reveals the absolute rot at the core of the leadership of the Labour Party, even during the Corbyn era. We can have no doubt that if Bernie Sanders was the nominee, that the same dynamics would be in play with the Democratic Party. This, though, is an escalation, to be clear. Bernie Sanders was never able to win a nomination, and though, of course, there were institutional biases against him. And I have no doubt the same dynamic would have played out with senior Democrats actively trying to make Sanders lose. The fact that this actually did happen in the case of Labour in the UK is a significant escalation and reveals the absolute rot at the center of American politics. Most liberals, most in the center, sadly, would prefer a right-wing government to an authentic left-wing government. This is proven definitively, at least in the case of these revelations. Our opposition is deep-rooted institutionally. A democratic version of these leaks would be just as damning, and we cannot treat institutions as neutral. Just as the left needs to be far more forgiving, relaxed, tolerant, infinitely less puritanical in its own dealings, it needs to apply somewhat of the friend-enemy distinction in politics and ruthlessly sideline its enemies and campaign properly from the beginning. We saw echoes of this. Bernie Sanders and the left media in general handing Elizabeth Warren's poisonous at worst and useless at best campaign with kid gloves, culminating in the heartbreaking reveal that Bernie Sanders was personally hurt by her lack of endorsement because, of course, as we all know, he obviously would have done the same for her. The campaign from the beginning not going hard at Joe Biden, talking about the innate risk propositions of his candidacy and correctly assessing the political field that the race was a contest fundamentally between Biden and Sanders. And of course, we also see this in the enormous efforts that President Obama did behind the scenes to coordinate the party in a ruthless display of power to block Sanders and the movement towards human decency in this country. We need to be real, and that is why phrases like ruthless actually needs to be deployed strategically and thoughtfully moving forward. Corbyn was under siege on all sides, a good man trying to implement a good agenda that would have saved countless lives in a crisis and improved many more day in and day out. Him and McDonald took extraordinary risks and did a lot for global democracy. However, he wasn't willing and probably not able to make the exact moves he needed to clean out the Labour Party, fire these folks, and clean out his opposition. Now, of course, during all of this time, part of the endless bleeding and whining from the centrists and the right of the Labour Party was that Corbyn ran some type of Stalinist cabal. Well, if only it were so. Labour's new leader, Keir Starmer, which we'll talk about later, has responded to these leaks, but has focused primarily on the fact of them being leaked, not the despicable nature of their revelations. He's not on the right of Labour, but he certainly is on the soft left and has not proven himself at all as of yet up to the task of aggressively challenging the Tory government or making accountable the obscene people that undermined a unique and essential opportunity for the UK in 2017 and the globe as a whole. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
Just that, I just think we really need to highlight the fact that we can't treat these institutions as neutral. We need to have a kind of Machiavellian understanding and a class understanding that specifically the Labour Party has been captured for the most part, especially in the leadership, the high-ranking officials, by people who are very hostile to our politics. And I think it's the same situation in the United States as well, obviously, with the Democratic Party. And if we think that, symbolic victories are just winning the election is the end of politics, then we're always going to lose, because a lot of politics is actually done behind the scenes. And sadly, we're seeing that, in these really frustrating labor leaks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just second that. I think this moment should be clarifying, and this primary, I think in general, that you can't really trust a lot of these people, and that these institutions are going to be much more closed to you than you thought they were, and we just need to be real about the battle it's gonna take there. That's the whole thing. Not to keep making this about the presidential election, but with Warren and Sanders, right? Warren played supposedly this this role that the inside game, right? She's the progressive that actually works with people, and obviously she got nowhere because that's not a real thing that exists. We're going to need to actually force these institutions to change. We're not going to be able to persuade them to.
Right. And of course, her actual only function was as a wrecker. And I think what also frustrates me, and one thing I'll actually give more latitude, because I think Labor I think Corbyn and McDonald and that faction, they could have done more, but they were running up against some very real limits. The war against them was so relentless. And from everything from the Israel lobby to the entirety of the UK press. Now, that is true with Sanders, but there was, the reason the lesson with Warren is so important is just like out of the gate, people just wrap themselves into pretzels to overthink something that's obvious, which is that two people are competing against each other. And they're competing against each other for votes in that is a zero-sum game, actually. And so spinning out all of these scenarios, it's not just that they're wrong. Like, of course, Warren's not going to team up with Bob Sanders and give him her delegates or whatever. Again, tragically, Sanders would probably do that for her, but she's not going to do that for him. And then the other thing is that, if the conditions of the race led to something like that happening, it would just happen. It would not be like a fantasy that was conjured from the beginning. It would be the process of a political conflict, a political battle. And so I just think all of these things, just point to, again, just that Machiavellian need, that serious need to look at power. And it really, frankly, has very little to do with, I see some pushback of sometimes people who say, well, but when you're working in institutions, you have to, you can't just always go at people or whatever. And first of all, that's 100% true. Of course not. And one of the paradoxes, and things we're synthesizing in this show is that, again, the left needs to be infinitely more appealing, infinitely more forgiving, infinitely more adaptable, infinitely more in touch with people's lives, without a doubt. And at the same time, some of that resistance you hear is, well, yes, that's true if your concern is getting future consulting contracts, or not building or not burning bridges, or not having uncomfortable debates. Or, I mean, I will totally say, and I think this show is very clear in the whole Warren regard from the beginning. And I also think there's value to diplomacy and strategy, constantly banging on that point. But you can see this, like, I stand 100% by my critiques of Yang, Gabbard, and Warren. 100%. Sorry if that upsets anybody. I would refine some of them a little bit, but basically I stand by those critiques. But there was, the social capital of Warren supporters made doing that different. And that's what people are talking about. And that isn't having institutional insight. That's just you not wanting to deal with conflict and stressful conversations, because the truth is you need to compete. Warren needed to be taken out from the beginning. It was a fucking ridiculous, embarrassing waste of time. And this was a really serious election. So anyway, now all of that didn't happen. And here we are today. We'll talk about Bernie Sanders. Actually, wait. First, I want to do a quick pitch. So, folks, as I keep saying, we're doing just fine. Folks are staying if you have the capacity. A lot of people are joining on higher levels, and that just allows us, again, to meet all of our obligations and, make sure everybody's doing well, and also to invest in things like the documentary series. If you haven't yet and you're watching this, I would immediately, first of all, if you can, smash the subscribe button, and then go, and if you haven't yet, watch our Illicit History playlist. Hit us with super chats during these shows. We don't answer super chat questions during the main shows. We only do those during the additional bonus live streams. But if you hit us with super chats, that's great if you're feeling it. But there's we've put in even more content for patrons. This 2-part series we just did with Daniel Bessner on what the left needs to unlearn and learn, using Gramsci's war of position and war of maneuver, talking about everything from comedy in Queens to how to build an actual institutional left. 2-part series with Joshua Kahn Russell recently, the spiritual, the political, the crisis we're in. There's going to be a 2-part conversation with Adolph Reed Jr., which I'm incredibly excited about. And we're doing these public streams. Grace Blakely was on Saturday. Watch that. This Sunday, Mark Blythe is joining us. And we just did the 2-part history with Samara Mashal. So there's a huge amount of work going on. You can go back into the archives and listen to the illicit history of the Third Way, of the British CIA coup on Iran, introductions to the work of CLR James and other luminaries. And of course, you also get another 2 hours of post-game. So my point being is that there's a great amount of work being done. This is actually a really important show in the world of, what we do. Obviously, it needs to get infinitely bigger than this and needs to expand out to every other branch of society. But the conversations that we have and the voices we're putting forward and what we're putting together is playing and will play an important role. And we still have our goals to reach. So, if you're listening and you're watching and you're in a position, it's time. Patreon.com/TMBS. We still want to hit that next near-term goal, which is 4,000 patrons. And then if sort of, in the horizon, a base of 7,000 patrons at once. There's other projects that we're already investing in and doing. We're going to do a series of TMBS guides, which will both be written books, and I'll also record audio downloadable versions of them as well. And of course, go to Red Emma's to buy Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. And tomorrow on Zero Books, Ben Burgess and I are going to be doing a stream on that book and its importance for today. So go join patreon.com/TMBS. And I see a lot of people watching. So if you haven't yet, immediately smash the like button. Thank you all. Honored by it. Okay. We'll talk about Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in the postgame, but let's talk about Barack Obama and Joe Biden now. We have some sound from Barack Obama's endorsement of Joe Biden, and we've got some stuff to unpack before we get to Paul O'Connell and Slavoj Zizek. Let's start with Barack Obama. This is the section where he talks about Bernie Sanders' role in the campaign, and this is the rhetorical push to the left. Let's check out President Obama.
Candidates were talented and decent, with a track record of accomplishment, smart ideas, and serious visions for the future. And that's certainly true of the candidate who made it farther than any other.
Oh my God.
Bernie Sanders.
Pause it.
Bernie's an American original, a man who has...
Sorry, I'm really trying to play this straight. It's so enraging. Like, just spare us, guy who pressured Klobuchar and Buttigieg out of the race, multi-hundred millionaire Netflix producer. Just spare us. Okay, but he won't, because that's the whole point. Let's go.
Has devoted his life to giving voice to working people's hopes, dreams, and frustrations. He and I haven't always agreed on everything, but we've always shared a conviction that we have to make America a fairer, more just, more equitable society. We both know that nothing is more powerful than millions of voices calling for change. And the ideas he's championed, the energy and enthusiasm he inspired, especially in young people, will be critical in moving America in a direction of progress and hope. Because for the second time in 12 years, we'll have the incredible task of rebuilding our economy. And to meet the moment, the Democratic Party will have to be bold. You know, I could not be prouder of the incredible progress that we made together during my presidency. But if I were running today, I wouldn't run the same race or have the same platform as I did in 2008. The world is different. There's too much unfinished business for us to just look backwards. We have to look to the future. Bernie understands that, and Joe understands that. It's one of the reasons that Joe already has what is the most progressive platform of any major party nominee in history. Because even before the pandemic turned the world upside down, it was already clear that we needed real structural change. The vast inequalities created by the new economy are easier to see now, but they existed long before this pandemic hit.
You can say that again.
Health professionals, teachers, delivery drivers, grocery clerks, cleaners, the people who truly make our economy run, they've always been essential. And for years, too many of the people who do the essential work of this country have been underpaid, financially stressed, and given too little support.
For 8 years.
On the exchange.
And that applies to the next generation of Americans. Young people graduating into unprecedented unemployment. They're going to need economic policies that give them faith in the future and give them relief from crushing student loan debt. So we need to do more than just tinker around the edges with tax credits or underfunded programs. We have to go further to give everybody a great education, a lasting career, and a stable retirement. We have to protect the gains we made with the Affordable Care Act, but it's also time to go further. We should make plans affordable for everyone, provide everyone with a public option, expand Medicare, and finish the job so that healthcare isn't just a right, but a reality for everybody. We have to return the U.S. to the Paris Agreement and lead the world in reducing the pollution that causes climate change. But science tells us we have to go much further, that it's time for us to accelerate progress on bold new green initiatives that make our economy a clean energy innovator, save us money, and secure our children's future. Of course, Democrats may not always agree on every detail of the best way to bring about each and every one of these changes. But we do agree that they're needed. And that only happens if we win this election. Because one thing everybody has learned by now is that the Republicans occupying the White House and running the U.S. Senate are not interested in progress. They're interested in power.
All right, that's it.
They've shown themselves willing to kick millions.
So let's start from backwards. There's a lot to tease out here. I'll kick to you guys in a second, but I just want to say, yes, that's why the Republicans win, and good on them for being interested in power and not vague, ephemeral ideas of bringing everybody together. Now, I also want to say too, we'll tease everything else apart. I'm not in a different place in terms of if you're in a swing state voting to get Trump out of office. I have not heard a compelling counter argument to that. I'm not going to be policing people. I'm not going to be demanding the people. I'm not going to be, doing the same. This show is really not going to be very much about that. Obviously, we're going to talk about the election, but there's a lot of other stuff that we got to deal with here because we're in a very bad situation. But that being said, don't indulge in any type of bedtime story. And that Barack Obama is pure obfuscation, bedtime story, and nonsense. You can disaggregate between that and the decision that is most intelligent and strategic to make. But people coming out and talking about the platform committees and looking at Obama's, they're not even bones. They're like little Triscuit treats to the left. This is a guy who supported single payer rhetorically when he was a state senator. This is somebody who, just like Bill Clinton, when he is not in office, Bill Clinton did very compelling critiques of a drug war that he accelerated. Barack Obama presided and expanded a vast bailout of Wall Street with zero accountability that further financialized the economy and ushered in the Silicon Valley temp economy that has caused so much devastation. That's the record. All right, guys.
I mean, I think it's very telling that, he barely went into any detail, and the only detail that he went into was basically saying that the Biden campaign, the way forward was not to pursue Medicare for all, right? I think it's time, and I think people are better aware of it than they were in 2008. But I think it's really important that we don't fall into this trap where it's like, this is what Democrats' game has always been. As you were saying, it's like they just motions like, look, these are all these problems in society. And then when it comes to do anything or to mobilize people about them, they give us platitudes. And, like the whole Obama, the whole Joe Biden politics right now is just to say, like, I get it, man, but we can't really do much about it. And that's fundamentally, that's why we're in the situation that we're in. I think that it's telling that Obama had to play behind the scenes this entire race. Like, making these deals happen. He wasn't very much out there in public, for example, like advocating for Joe Biden. I think
he wants to preserve his capital.
I think that's the Obama reality. And I mean, we'll see, but I just don't see how much this is going to move people at this point, because Joe Biden is just on the simple level of the fact that Joe Biden is going to continue to reveal himself as somebody who's just very much incapable mentally of performing at this level. I don't know. I think that it's going to be a very difficult case to make over the next few months.
I don't look to Obama for a whole lot of sincerity in these things, but even for me, looking at him in those close-ups, when you can see his eyes scanning the written words that he's reading back and forth,
yep, there's
something terrifying about looking at like how just checked out some of these people are. Like, yeah, I'll throw this to Joe. Hope November turns out well. It's like, I hope so too. But like you said, I mean, remember even like 2016, the idea that Obama's going to drop a video and everyone's going to like actually get interested in that. Like, we're way beyond that now.
That was a piece that I read. One of the pieces, I think it was either in the New York Times or Politico. I don't have it in front of me, but it was talking about, basically, again, the reporting is very clear. There was a minute there where those of us who responded to the first reporting, and it was really obvious that Obama was talking with Buttigieg and Klobuchar and nudging things, or not just, orchestrating, clearing the field for Biden. And we all said that. And there was, of course, this was like how these things always work, which is the left says something, and then people are like, well, actually, that sounds kind of conspiratorial. And then 6 weeks later, it just reported that that's what happened. So now it's like definitively, yes, exactly, just like with labor. So now it's definitively reported that Obama played this role. And again, I guess this is the thing where it's like, I'm an outlier. It's just like, yeah, of course he did that. Why would this surprise anybody? Like, duh.
At the same
we know
time,
who Barack.
let's drive that lesson home to people, because there's a lot of people that seem invested in bullshitting about it right now.
That's insane. Yeah. Barack Obama is the leader of the right-wing corporate wing of the Democratic Party. If that triggers you, or you want to nibble around, do what he said, I agree. Now is not the time for nibbling around the edges. Now is the time for big, clear, definitive policy. And again, this is also where the left needs to be really real. We have been defeated. Defeat is not eternal. Defeat does not mean that we won't eventually win. Defeat doesn't mean that you can't have some optimism. But the rhetoric of optimism now is delusional. We've suffered a huge defeat. There aren't easy, apparent answers. I will read my Nancy McLean and look at Democracy in Chains. I will think of DACA, and I will say, yeah, I think it's a good idea to get rid of Donald Trump. But I also could tell you that anybody who's telling you like, oh, no, you got to listen to those words, these words, they're so important. They don't mean a fucking thing. They beat us. There were some mistakes that we made. Oh, and there was a whole cable news running as a super PAC against Bernie Sanders. Barack Obama, and this is the thing I was going to cite in that article, is that they have the idea that Obama can still mobilize the youth vote. And it was one of those moments for me where I don't have any political or ethical expectations of the Democratic Party leadership. They're gone. It's not even that they're gone. We just have completely different views of the world. We care about poverty. We care about delivering for everybody. We care about a democratized future. This is not what these people's ideology is. It's not what their policy set is. And they've worked for decades to create precisely the opposite. But that's delusional. I always say, when I see something that's delusional, whether it be from any ideological corner, in a way, that's what freaks me out most. And if you think that Barack Obama in 2020 is 2016, that should have already been the lesson. Forget 2012. I mean, let alone 2008, 2006. The moment is done. And the very funny thing and kind of depressing thing about President Obama is that, of course, as the first black president, that's history, period, full stop. That's it. And this, his political talent is undeniable. But the rest of it is going to be consolidated Wall Street and Silicon Valley, went and made a massive amount of money, used his political influence with efficacy to stop reform of the Democratic Party when he went to the mat against Keith Ellison, and to muscle out the movement that was actually in large part driven by people who, in a lot of cases, their first act of belief in politics was his campaign. Yeah, from the younger generation perspective.
I mean, I think that's a good point. And also, when he says, obviously he's not going to come out and say exactly what he means by this, but when he says, I have many disagreements with Bernie, that's something that we really need to be unpacking. Remember, this is somebody who, during one of the Obama saying we're living through another financial crisis. I mean, the stage was set very much by his response to the crisis. Obama, in a meeting of CEOs, in the height of the crisis, said, my administration is the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks. When literally, and obviously there's structural problems with Occupy, but literally there was a mass mobilization of people across this country demanding something different, right? There were political opportunities, political space. People, wanted something different and were quite vocal about it. But Obama, it was
even worse, David. I'm sorry. I just have to say, timeline-wise, it was even worse. Because he said the pitchfork thing in the very beginning, before Occupy. At the same moment, he was intimating to people on the left, telling the Roosevelt story that may or may not be true, the quote-unquote make me do it thing.
Yeah.
Then they did Occupy. He took some of their rhetoric and gave an inequality speech where he promoted something like tax credits or whatever. And then... And you can look, the Department of Homeland Security facilitated and backed police departments in cities across the country in destroying those encampments. Yeah. So it's even worse.
No, I think that's an important clarification. I mean, look, this is the reality, and it's also, I mean, it's just saying one thing, do another. The tax credit talk. I mean, I learned about how Democrats love to talk about using tax credits instead of dealing with structural issues from watching the Obama administration. I mean, the fact is that the young people, like, these are dead politics to folks. I know there's a lot of people who, like, especially there's like people who are in the Bernie camp, and then there's a kind of youth population that, I don't know, some of them are pro Bernie, some of them aren't as, like, in our camp directly, and they like memes and, about, like, Pelosi clapping and stuff like that. Like, Obama might have sway with those people, but I don't think that represents any kind of massive coalition. I guess it's just like, I think the Democrats are making a huge gamble, obviously, on Joe Biden. We know the fact is, though, that we lost. But it's very disheartening to see how willing this party is to, I don't know, to basically squash a mass movement again for the benefit of the rich. And I think it's very telling what Obama has done in his post-presidency, which has basically been cashing in on the fact that he effectively was the person standing in between these CEOs and the pitchforks. I mean, that's the real Obama legacy.
I'm going to be able to make documentaries about how shitty everything is for the next 30 years.
I mean, yeah, that's like the outcome, is that in 6 years, I'm EPing something about, it's kind of an imaginative documentary of what if Bernie won. Might have been kind of nifty. Let's get that to the Academy Awards. Maybe Harvey Weinstein Jr. can produce it. That's exactly what it is. That's the very, I mean, obviously with Obama, it would never be applied to foreign policy, but that whole mindset of, like, the people that I just can't get over this. I don't remember I don't even remember this was a joke that we first made or somebody on Twitter that I can't credit. I don't know the origin, but, like, after the coup in Bolivia of when, you had, like, a bunch of idiots saying that it wasn't a coup. And I remember somebody, and again, it literally could have been one of us, but the joke was, and it could have been somebody else, but the joke was something to the effect of, like, oh, do you need to wait for 3 years for when Netflix produces, like, a thoughtful documentary for you to realize what's happening in front of your face?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and that is, like, that's why when Obama puts out his reading list, and, who knows if he's even, I mean, look, obviously he reads, there's another thing that, the liberal classes are very into. Obama's a very smart guy. He reads. I don't know if he actually read Surveillance Capitalism, but it is extraordinary. Audible. I was there. I was sitting on Richard Branson's yacht, and I was listening. I was watching. I was crazy. I was watching Alicia Keys give Timbaland brain. No,
we were doing cannonballs, and I had it on the speakers, and I could hear about every other paragraph because I was.
And apparently, I did not do much to make sure that Facebook wasn't getting your pictures.
I mean, with that being said, the Obama campaign was lauded for its use of targeted ads using Facebook's, information and all of that, while Donald Trump is demonized for it.
See, this is a really good point. And this is a point where I think people always need to make the distinction that, like, part of the thing with Trump was that Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, like, apparently illegally obtained certain data. Like, you have to make these distinctions. And at the same time, 100%.
Yeah.
The 2012, the whole media narrative was like, these guys have the best private spying behavioral anticipation apparatus in the history of campaigns. Mm-hmm. And then when, of course, Trump and the Mercers and Bannon are going to do something that is going to, like, almost certainly, I would assume, get even illegal, which is, when you think about how lightly regulated everything is, if they broke the law, that's incredible. Right. Yes. But it is going to be like, but it is going to be. And again, that's another thing that tracks with a lot of the voting population. That's what people sniff. Mm-hmm. We've said this before, like, people's hatred of liberal hypocrisy and liberal bullshit is not all Republican manufactured talking points. It is a felt sense amongst a lot of people, including folks that are not reactionary at all. And that's a great example of, like, when we do it, it's innovative. Let's do an MIT symposium. When you do it, that's Russia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Did you see the person going after Bree because she mentioned the word Burisma? It's like, do you honestly, do you really think the average American cares as much about Ukrainian politics as they do about a local politician's kid getting a free ride at a fucking oil company somewhere? Like, that's the stuff that actually gets through to people. I don't care about like making them see a more rational be more rational about geopolitical politics, as Meghan McCain would say. Like, it's everyone understands what a dumb kid getting a job is. Like,
everybody understands what a dumb kid getting a job is. It's a time when we need to get more real about geopolitical politics, which is why I'm endorsing Joe Biden and launching a new Audible podcast with Michelle, where we look at the community change makers. These are the people that love the community change makers. And I mean, it's another reason that we can't fetishize words like movement, whatever, because it's like, you don't know what it means most of the time. And it's commodified by people, by the Obamas of the world.
Maybe just use that type of terminology in retrospect as a historian.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and also we'll talk about it in the post game, but frankly, it's more justifiable with Biden because he's not all there. Mm-hmm. But one of the most disturbing things about the Biden-Bernie thing is like, and I'm sorry, you're not going to get hate for Bernie from me. Sorry, folks. And actually, and if you want to be fucking pissed at Bernie about anything, it's his role in the bailout. That was a failure of leadership. And I have no problem saying
the recent one.
Sorry?
The recent one.
The recent one. Yeah. Oh, no, it was great in the last one. And there's a lot of, I get why he did, but I'm saying if you're looking for a reason to critique him, that there's valid critique there. Him doing this is, look, Bernie was really concerned about Trump, and Bernie always said he was going to do this. But Joe Biden looks like he's reading a teleprompter during that thing. And it's just so bizarre to be in dialogue, and reading a teleprompter. And and Obama's there just doing like, I still got this. Check it out. I remember this is like back when I first told people in Hyde Park that I cared about affordable housing. Mm-hmm. I don't give a fuck. Say it the Netflix gala, motherfucker. I mean, the thing with Obama, and of course Obama's not Tony Blair. Obama's, he has a very good sense of personal PR. He's very strategic. He's not as utterly, he's not craven and venile in the way a Bill Clinton or Tony Blair is. But like, even if we're doing these measurements, this is not Jimmy Carter. This is a guy who left office and was like, I want to be a showbiz impresario and make a lot of money. And that's an important class context to understand because, I could tell you what, I know that President Obama, I am sure he's disturbed and appalled by Trump, but I'm also sure that he doesn't have any, he's going to be fine if there's another 4 years of Trump. Look at tax cuts.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's we know this already. And I think the problem that we're going to have to face, is one, I don't know, institutionally within the Democratic Party beating these people. And then two, in the popular narrative, being able to make this story a little clearer to some people. I don't think that this is going to do much for the Bernie people. I don't think it's going to do much for the young people. I think they're pissed off and they're right.
I don't think so.
But there's
what more you want, devils?
I thought Bernie was our cult leader. Don't we have to listen to
exactly
what he says? I already ordered all my Biden merchandise.
Bernie, spin the dreidel so you can activate your cult.
I mean, that's the point I just want to make about
white people can't think independently. So if you endorse Joe, it'll be fine.
About this whole Biden thing, like we're already just moved into voter discipline mode. It's because, and not into like let's knock on doors for Biden mode. It's because these people are not workers themselves; they are managers.
Right.
Like that's who feels represented in this campaign right now, and that's going to be a problem. I hope they win, but that's going to be the problem, and not Bernie.
No, that's 100% right. Because now is the time for you guys to get active. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing, and that's it. I mean, it's extraordinary to watch somebody like Mehdi Hasan, who legitimately does some really good work. I don't have any I obviously have disagreements, but I don't have some big beef with him at all. But it's like, Just tactically, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Unless the game is just emotional payoff and career advancement with other people, which I don't want that to be the case. But there's no way on earth that you could possibly think that this is going to help you achieve what you say you want to achieve. It's just not. It's just utterly not strategic. But I think, Matt, you nailed it. It's worker bees versus managers, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going to get any worker bees for this. Like, that's not going to happen. So you better figure it out. And look, Joe Biden showed that you know what? Like, you can swoop in with a consolidated media and party apparatus and it will totally blow that stuff out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it'll work. But look, we're going with that play. So don't bitch at people. Go do what you got to do.
Yeah. I think they've made their strategy, and I think that they need to accept it. I think that they've dealt with the left, before Bernie. That was pretty, they kick and scream every once in a while, but they weren't organized in any sense or fashion. Whereas, like, you could just sort of smack them on the head and make them do what you want. And I don't think that we're in that kind of dynamic anymore. And the strategy is not going to work for them. And it's also like on our side too. We're not organized to be able to utilize it to our benefit either, unfortunately.
That's right. All right, so let's get to Paul O'Connell. Is he? All right. Yeah, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Paul O'Connell. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Shortly, we'll get to Slavoj Zizek joining, or not too shortly, because first we have a really important conversation I'm very excited about with Paul O'Connell. He's a labor organizer and activist in the UK. He also teaches law at SOAS. Paul, thank you so much for staying up for us. How are you doing?
I'm good, Michael. Thanks very much for having me on. Happy to be on.
No, it's a great pleasure. We've already done an in-depth segment for patrons. This is our second conversation. Very good to have you on the main show. So these labor revelations, I talked about them in the opening commentary. People have a sense of them. Can you maybe talk about the scale of them, and I guess place it in relationship with the two things, because I think these are kind of important things. So there's plenty of just disgusting stuff. The stuff about Diane Abbott really jumps out. And, at the same time, hopefully, not all of us, it would be as bad, but there is this element of, if you go through anybody's, privacy is a good thing, and people blow off steam and they say things and whatever. And sure, there could be egg on people's face. Maybe even they could be revealed to be real assholes, but the structural importance, we don't know. Mm-hmm. Then there's the whole element of what they actually did to the campaign. And I'd like, tactically and structurally. And then I'd also like you to put this in relationship to how much of this, in a sense, that we already know contemporaneously, mm-hmm. in terms of the effort to really ruthlessly undermine Corbyn.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Yeah, so it's been it seems like every day is hectic, but it's been a hectic few days, obviously, because fairly recently, it was clear, we discussed it on the last time I was on with you, it was clear more or less from the start that Keir Starmer was going to win the election to be the new leader. That was confirmed recently, so that has sort of set in motion a period of soul searching for many people in the Labour Party, and then obviously everything that's happening around COVID-19. The British government has been almost as negligent as your government in how they've dealt with it. It's more than 11,000 people dead now, and absolutely abysmal. So all that's happening, and then this report is leaked, and it details, as you mentioned, it details three key things. First, it details that blockages in dealing with allegations of anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, and so forth within the party were a result of intentional factional obfuscation by senior staffers within the Labour Party. So people who were paid full-time to work for the Labour Party were actively undermining efforts to investigate these claims. That's important because a narrative that was used quite successfully against Corbyn and was attempted against Sanders, I recall at one stage, is that he supports and encourages and facilitates anti-Semitism. And so the fact that these complaints weren't being dealt with quick enough seemed to vindicate that and seemed to sort of uphold that, when in fact it's shown that it was his political opponents who were consciously doing this. It also reveals, as you've mentioned as well, the sort of endemic racism, sexism, misogyny, quite frankly, hysterical anti-socialism of the right of the Labour Party in great depth. They talk about all the new members being trots and going trot hunting and various other things. They talk about certain young members who are known to have mental health problems, hoping that they would die in a fire, hoping that Corbyn would die in a fire. You know, a whole range of obscene, really unpleasant things. And then also it revealed that in 2017, when the Labour Party under Corbyn, against all odds, against most expectations, came within 2,000 votes in 7 key seats of possibly being able to form a government, that the some of its most senior staff had been working actively against the campaign. So, you know, people in Britain had already experienced almost 10 years of austerity and Tory and Lib Dem government. The working class have been suffering, you know, immensely. Migrants, all the vulnerable communities have been suffering immensely. Corbyn offered the chance of something different in 2017, and this report demonstrates in clear detail that senior staffers, full-time paid staffers from the Labour Party who were campaigning against this, and then when it looked like the party was going to do far better than was expected, they were distraught. They were sort of heartbroken over this. So, you know, it reveals that, which is absolutely bleak.
So what's the response? I mean, actually, 2 parts. Tell us about Keir Starmer, the new leader, the type of front bench that he put together, and what has his response been to these revelations so far?
So I suppose I'll tell you as a response first, which is sort of indicative of everything else that has happened. So Starmer has positioned himself as a soft left candidate, and he's been greeted as such by other sections of the left in the Labour Party who are looking for good reasons to continue with what they're doing within Labour, and it's completely understandable. He's been greeted as soft left, but he's much more he's much more establishment than that. You know, he's soft left in the sense that I'm sure he's got fairly good politics and fairly liberal views on sort of a whole range of social issues. But fundamentally, he's an establishment figure. He was the former director of public prosecutions here in Britain, so the chief prosecutor of criminal offences here in Britain. And in that role, he oversaw the persecution of young, mainly black and minority men after the London riots, handing down extremely severe sentences for the most trivial of criminal offences. He also refused to launch a serious investigation into or to pursue any police officers after the execution of John Charles Jimenez, a Brazilian man who was shot dead by British police because they thought he looked Arab. And it was so again, this was under Starmer's watch that he didn't investigate that and so forth. So he's not cuddly, soft liberal. He's a hard-nosed, no-nonsense establishment figure. And in the Labour Party, he pitched himself as the sort of sensible candidate post the excesses of the Corbyn period. You know, that we'd had this period of trying out the socialism thing, and it failed abysmally. This is the sort of narrative. And someone like Starmer, much like the narrative in the US with Biden, is electable. He's a haircut in a suit, and he says all the right things and doesn't offend the right people. And so therefore, he can be trusted. His response to this has been entirely predictable. Him and Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, have launched an investigation. But when you read the language that accompanied the statement launching this investigation, they place on a par, as a question of concern, the fact that this report was leaked. So the first thing is that not what's in the report, but the fact that the report was leaked. You want to find out how this got into the public domain. Now that's significant because certain media figures who were critical and antagonistic to Corbyn for the last 5 years have picked up this narrative. Again, they're all saying, oh, this is a breach of privacy and this is a breach of due process and various other things. So it's really concerning how this information got out in public. And also there's some unpleasant things that have been said in it, and we should look into that. So they've relegated the central issue to an ancillary issue and will now pursue this investigation. They haven't, as they would have been entirely justified in doing, they haven't suspended the people who are still Labour Party members, who are named and clearly it seems from the evidence, clearly complicit in these activities. They haven't been suspended pending investigation. Other Labour Party members for far less serious issues in the past have been suspended pending investigation, have been hounded by the bureaucracy. So there'll be an investigation. I wouldn't hold out much hope of the investigation leading anywhere. Labour Party members have said there must be justice now for what's gone on here. And I think people will have to lower their expectations of what justice entails if they think they're going to get any from this investigation. So Starmer's response in that sense is of a piece with the shadow cabinet he's assembled around himself. The people, initially it was greeted as being positive because they weren't sort of red and toot and claw right-wing members of the Labour Party. They were sort of soft left, ambiguous, somewhere in between. And then in the second wave of appointments, he appointed some of the worst right-wing members of the party, Jess Phillips, Wes Streeting, people who spent, again, 4 or 5 years publicly undermining Corbyn. I mean, that's another important point. People are rightly upset about this report, but we have to bear in mind that this was an echo of what was being done in public by Labour Party MPs. So Corbyn had a tiny number of MPs in Parliament Britain who were actual socialists, who were actually left-wing, people like John Triquet, Ian Lavery, Laura Smith, Laura Pidcock. They got a handful compared to the rest of the PLP. So he was completely outnumbered. They attacked him on the question of anti-Semitism, which was horrendous because it was patently contrived. You know, obviously anti-Semitism is an extremely serious issue. There are definitely some anti-Semites in the Labour Party, as there are in every walk of life. But the rhetoric around the Labour Party posing an existential threat to Jewish people in Britain and so on, it was horrendous, clearly cynical, clearly contrived, and yet all of these people give credence to it. They also, which we'll probably come back onto later when we talk about this, they used the question of a second vote on the EU referendum to undermine Corbyn. It was a wedge that he drove into Corbyn's base between some sort of soft left liberals who supported Corbyn but also didn't like the idea of Brexit, and other socialists who supported Corbyn and wanted to leave the European Union. And they used this as a wedge. It's interesting. One of the main perpetrators in this report, or one of the main individuals, after he left the Labour Party, went on to become the director of the People's Vote campaign, which was the main umbrella group pushing for a second vote and so forth. So the sort of overlap and the links between the politics have become clear in that sense. So Starmer is going to be a restoration leader. The right didn't get one of their own straight into the leader's position, but Starmer is somebody who will effectively implement the sort of changes in policies which will undo the limited gains that were made under the Corbyn period.
So I'm curious, and I don't know how direct the analogy is, but the conversation that we've been sort of cycling through in the left of the United States is this paradox where on one hand there is, you know, and there's Mark Fisher, there's the vampire castle, there's this subcultural politics which can get, you know, it's almost like a religious revival. It's very fanatical. It's very, gets extremely focused on just sort of petty gossip and controlling and policing and this sort of thing. And it's both, you know, as I always say, I'm being very repetitive now, but again, it generates a horrific culture internally, and it's deeply unappealing to a broader electorate. And, you know, and again, that just making these basic distinctions between, obviously, there are, in fact, certain red lines on policy about equity and dignity for absolutely every single human being, period, full stop, is totally distinct from trying to force a particular type of sets of very narrative, a very limited sort of sets of beliefs, behaviors, and thoughts and words even, which is, again, is just a completely failed project. And I think the left needs to excise that completely if it hopes to have a power project. And then that's actually coupled with that when we're actually playing politics, we're still the kind of, you know, we're just not serious. You know, like I said in the, and I don't, you know, another thing I'd actually like to excise is the kind of like cheeky Soviet Union references or whatever. But in the Corbyn case, it really was actually hysterical. I mean, almost painfully hysterical, because you could see these reports on, you know, Corbyn and McDonald are running this like Stalinist cabal, and they're ruthless, and it's like, oh, if only it were so. I mean, they're not sidelining anybody. They're letting these people get away with murder. And so I'm really curious about and as you think out in the horizon, because one of the things that struck me is that obviously you supported Rebecca Long Bailey, as I'm sure I would have done if I was in the UK. But a couple of months ago, you were already really talking about of like absorbing a defeat, getting real about what a bad state we're in, which is, I think, exactly where we need to be in the United States, that this is really a time for rethinking and re-strategizing because it's bad. There's no, there's sparks and shoots here and there, but it's bad. And we need to rethink things. And so as you think about the prospects for actually creating a power project, What do you think is the lesson of somehow, on one hand, generating a left that's far more compassionate, appealing, well-adjusted in a certain sense, but then actually also takes, frankly, has a much more Machiavellian approach to actually doing politics? If you say this thing about Jeremy Corbyn, get the fuck out. If you're and then conversely, when you're going to the doorsteps, actually have a vastly different, empathy and attunement to where people actually are and what their concerns are. But if you're in the Labour Party and please.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, doesn't it? I think that, there's a range of important points there, and sort of impossible because I know we have a bit of time to deal with it all. But
no, please take your time. Yeah.
But so there's a guy called John McTiernan who was a senior figure in the Labour Party under Tony Blair, and a couple of weeks ago, before Starmer was formally confirmed as the new leader, McTiernan wrote an article which was 6 points, six words of advice for incoming leader Starmer, and the first was be fast, be ruthless, take out your enemies. He used the language of break their knees, these various things. Now, there was a mixed response to that. One response was, oh, this is appalling that someone would say that. Another response was, oh, well, he's just a harmless old sort of hangover from the Blair era. But it wasn't. This was like thinking out loud in how these people actually operate. And this is the problem, is that the left, and certainly it's not in Corbyn's disposition to be someone like this. And it's actually part of a problem with Labourism, and I think in some respects part of a problem with the Democratic Party in the US as well, that the left is far more respectful of the rules of conduct and far more fearful of damaging the unity of the project than the right is. The right doesn't care. They literally will break your knees and move on. And it was interesting when Johnson won the Conservative leadership contest late last year. He came in and he said, this is going to be our position on Brexit. And a couple of his MPs went, oh, well, I'm not so sure. He said, you're out. And then you have these Labour MPs in Parliament saying, this is terrible how he's treating these people. I remember watching, I was thinking, if only Corbyn had announced that, if only Corbyn had a fraction of that ruthlessness, we could have had a very different last couple of years. With that said, there were structural factors that impeded Corbyn. So in the first instance, they were massively outnumbered in the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party. He had a tiny minority of MPs who he could rely upon, who would back him in various things. There was 2 attempted coups to get rid of him. There was a whole set of things. And within the bureaucracy, which this report revealed, so the political parties in the UK operate, they have a sort of permanent bureaucracy that is ostensibly sort of professional and independent and sort of, stick there, whoever the leader is, whatever the case may be. So the bureaucracy was completely against them, and this report revealed actively worked against Corbyn and Corbyn supporters, diverting funds into the seats of MPs who were on their sort of faction sympathetic to them, and undermining what Corbyn was trying to do, failing to provide information to Corbyn, doing various things. But the other key factor that Corbyn didn't have, and this is probably one of the key things we still have to address now, is there wasn't an extra parliamentary force that was active and powerful and that could embolden Corbyn and people around them to pursue a more radical stance. That's the reality of it. That basically everything got reduced down to what was happening and what was possible within the Labour Party and within Parliament, and the bigger social movement outside it wasn't there. So that has been a problem from the start. That's been a weakness. Brexit was a disaster for a variety of reasons, but one of them was that it distracted so much energy from all the other things we should have been doing. So long before Cameron called the referendum on Brexit, many of us were involved in anti-austerity campaigns, we were involved in campaigns around migrant rights, we were involved in campaigns for the families of people who were murdered by the police, and a whole range of other campaigns trying to build that social base. But once Brexit came along, it took so much energy from everyone. It became the focus of everything. So
it's funny. It's not the same thing at all, because he's the executive, he's the president. So it's fundamentally a much bigger deal than Brexit. But there is a parallel with everything becomes Trump. Mm-hmm. You can't game out other things. Yeah.
And people sort of lose their critical faculties in a way. This is one of the key things. Sort of you mentioned there about when we discussed back in January about sort of the fact that Rebecca Long Bailey had lost before she started. Also the fact that Rebecca Long Bailey being the left candidate, and she absolutely was, but that was actually part of the problem, because if you saw some of her positions, how quickly she caved into the Board of Deputies and their sort of narrative around anti-Semitism and so forth, how weak she was on the question of Brexit in the preceding months and so forth. So the fact that she was the left candidate after 4 or 5 years of a Corbyn project actually revealed how little had been gained and how much progress had been made within the party. But the bigger problem is that now one of the concerns, and I'm sure you've read, but like Amilcar Cabral is such an important figure and has a really clear principle for us about the need for revolutionary truth telling, that we have to constantly say things as they are. Now, that isn't about nihilism, and it isn't about resignation, and it isn't about going, oh, everything's crap and we can't do anything about it. That's about having an actual understanding of what's going on and then building out from there. And within the Labour Party, there isn't a tradition really of serious theoretical work around the nature of the politics that they're doing. There are lots of sort of appeals to the moral correctness of what they're trying to do. You know, we want things to be better for everyone, and that's the main thing. But that's not sufficient. And there's no critical self-reflection on the limitations of Labourism. Now, with what's just happened with this report, with Starmer now, there's lots of people who have left the Labour Party, and it's a real shame because there's no real vehicle for them to go into outside of it. And the danger is lots will just drift off. Lots of people who become politically active for the first time will just drift away and sort of resign themselves. Others will drift off into the sort of milieu of smaller left-wing groups in the UK, which has their own pathologies, and I'm sure there's similar issues in the US and the left over there, and the smaller groups in the left. And that would be a real loss. And this goes back to one of the points you made about the vampire castle and sort of the poisonous culture around a lot of the online left, if you want to call it that. But sort of unfortunately, it doesn't stay online. It goes beyond it and impacts everything else. That around this anti-Semitism stuff and Corbyn. So it was clear, plain as day, that this was a contrived issue. And again, I'm somebody who's been involved in anti-fascist politics for 18 years in different ways. And so it's not something I'd take lightly, but it was clearly contrived. And it was about very real prospect. It was two things. On the one hand, there was certain sections and certain groups who despised the idea of a Labour leader with such pro-Palestinian views as Corbyn had. And then on the other hand, the cynical right of the party just saw it as a wedge and just something to attack them with and just something to use. Problem is the soft left in Britain, the section of the British left that has sort of mainly come through the student politics milieu or possibly come from more middle class backgrounds and are very concerned with this sort of, correct discourse and so forth, that they were then trapped in a sort of cage of their own making, because again, you can't be morally policing everyone and then suddenly back off it. So then when the Guardian newspaper over here, opinion writer, starts sort of condemning Corbyn for anti-Semitism, and all the sort of respectable liberal sort of media outlets are condemning Corbyn, this section of the left gave in. They caved in. Now, interestingly, another section of the Labour base didn't, and a lot of that was, and again, this is sort of crude because I don't have the empirical data on it, but from what I can see, a lot of that was working class people who were newly politicised, who didn't have the same vocabulary and didn't have the same sort of socialisation that these other activists had. And a lot of them just went, well, no, this is nonsense. This clearly is the case, and we're not having this. And then there was a schism there. These sort of younger activists who had the student politics background, but then look at these older ones, mainly working class, and go, oh, you're just cranks, and you're racist, and you're conspiracy theorists. And then a lot of those people have just left and drifted away, and a new group called the Workers' Party, GB, has been formed, which is, it seems like a sort of vanity project that doesn't have much sort of steam to it, but some people have gone into that and they'll spend a few years in there, and we'll see what comes of that. But that is a serious problem, and again, there's one of the real concerns in the midst of everything now is that following the election defeat, following the election now of Starmer, following the revelations of this report, there's an inability so far, or an unwillingness to sort of learn hard lessons and to sort of critically self-reflect. Instead, there's the big mantra now from sections of the British left is, well, just stay in Labour because we have to stay in and we have to fight. And there's a famous slogan from Tony Benn that there's no final defeat and there's no final victory. And that's all well and good, but there are more or less likely defeats depending on how you understand what's happened previously. And so that's still the big challenge, is to try and, certainly one thing we're doing here in Manchester with activists, we're having a sort of Zoom meetings to try and discuss how we improve the aspect of political education, which has been neglected by Corbyn, neglected by Momentum, neglected by the left in general, and we need to address that alongside community organising and various other things.
Yeah, no, I love that, because if we were in an infinitely better position and we started to just get rid of all of that just kind of middle class morality stuff, you could have a dynamic where, in the dynamic you explained earlier, the kids could listen to the adults and smarten up and have some street sense and some cynicism. And then everybody collectively across the board could start reading Cabral together and, starting to sort of think through some things. And obviously I really appreciate that you mentioned him, but, so is that, we'll get to Žižek later. And one thing that Žižek actually has always struck me with is that the point that he's sort of made of like, yeah, of course action is necessary. We're in a multi-world crisis. You know, there isn't a single metric we could look at in which we aren't in deep threat and crisis, environment, technology, proliferation, whatever else. But if we don't actually think and work out our roadmaps a bit, then what exactly are we going to do here? And the fear I have is cynicism, we don't have the luxury of cynicism, and certainly not the most vulnerable and most beaten, and certainly not the, working class. Of course not. It's never a call for nihilism, but that idea of, we just got to put our heads down and go forward. Well, no, because it's not working. So in that spirit, and I love what you already said about education, but I mean, what else would you sort of put forth if we're thinking in a 10-year horizon to actually seriously think about maybe the way we could make a play here and get into much better shape on the left and think strategically about where we could actually be and the opportunities that are arising? Because certainly, unfortunately, more and more people will be receptive to our analysis because these material conditions are so awful.
Yeah. So I think just that point, there's an anecdote that I sort of picked up a few years ago, and that it comes back to me time and time again. Every time we have a new crisis, which seems to be much more frequently than it used to be these days. But at the outbreak of World War One, Lenin is in Switzerland in a library reading Hegel's Logic. You know what I mean? He's not rushing off to the barricades to get things going. He takes a step back, and there was factors of necessity that meant he had to be in Switzerland, but he takes a step back and he tries to clarify and reorientate his thinking. And that period is then seen as being formative, because it's subsequent to that we get Lenin's most penetrating works on politics and the nature of the state, nature of organization, and so forth. So thinking and practice are crucially involved. And the problem is that everybody will accept that in principle. Everybody go, yeah, of course we have to do both. And then in practice, people will prioritize one over the other invariably and make a virtue of it. And there's a big problem. One of the big problems we have, and you see it in the UK left, and you see it in the American left. You see it. I'm mostly familiar with the Anglo sort of sphere left in that respect. It's a sort of emergence of a left which is very theory focused, which is good, and this is people who've come out of university and gone through university and haven't got the career prospects that they probably thought they had when they first went into university, and it's really good. But the problem with that is that when it becomes theory and ideas divorced from concrete practice and struggles, and then on the other hand you have the traditions of just struggle, just like whether it's in trade unions, whether it's in the Labour Party, whether it's in different sort of organizations, that you just get the work done. We just torn up, we keep doing it. And the problem with that, as you say, is you can just keep making the same mistakes over and over again, and keep repeating those problems. So it's having a unity of the two, which is the key thing going forward. Now one of the things that's happened with Starmer being elected is two different groups. I mean, again, this is a tragicomic. Two different factions have emerged within Momentum. So I'm sure but for anybody who doesn't know, Momentum is a left-wing campaign group which is aligned to the Labour Party but is separate from it. With the sort of election of Starmer and the restoration sort of leadership that he's going to have in there, the left of the Labour Party now sees Momentum as being the vehicle that can advance their politics. But there's two different factions already of the left of the Labour Party who are now vying for control of Momentum. And there's, of course, the sort of existing Momentum hierarchy who aren't going without a fight, or who won't sort of roll over in terms of what happens next. So that's going to happen. They're going to carry on that struggle. And I think the key thing now is that it doesn't matter if people stay in Labour or leave Labour. There are arguments on either side of that, very good arguments, very well-rehearsed arguments. But for years, many of us have been saying, and we've been having these discussions for years, we've been saying we need to do the political education work, right? And this is the problem here, is that everybody accepts it in principle and then nobody does it. Or if people do something that they think is political education, it'll be one version of just teaching people how to canvass on the doorstep, or just teaching people how to phone bank, and that's seen as a form of political education, or it'll be an attempt at some sort of pursuit of hyper reified theoretical texts. And so I've engaged in, which again is valuable. I sort of partly do it for a living in a sense. There's no problem with that. But the real political education we need to be doing is understanding the Marxist and the socialist tradition and getting a serious grasp on that. Because again, even with the revelations in this report, for example, so this report will be picked up and has been picked up, and people see the horrendous language in it, and especially the racism directed at Diane Abbott and Don Butler, and the contemptuous language in it. And they'll say these people who did this are completely horrendous, nasty people, and something needs to be done about them, right? And it might be done about the individuals. But the problem is that this is structural. This is an inbuilt characteristic of social democratic parties in capitalist democracies. This isn't just bad people doing bad things. I saw a report the evening that Bernie withdrew his candidacy, that Hillary Clinton's camp sent out an email to all former staffers inviting them in for a drink. So there's been no report leaked out of the Democratic Party yet, but you can be damn sure something similar has been happening in the Democratic Party in different ways and at different levels to undermine Bernie's campaign as well. So that goes without saying. The fact that this happens time and time again, that has happened for the last 100 years in social democratic parties in capitalist countries, is structural. It's baked into how these parties operate and exist within capitalist democracies. So we have to have that awareness, and that doesn't mean then leaving Labour, and it doesn't mean leaving the Democrats, it doesn't mean walking away from it, but it means understanding concretely what you're doing in there. And that is one of the problems with the left in Britain, certainly, is that people got too swept up in what was happening around the Corbyn moment, understandably, because we need something, we need a win, we need an alternative, we need something different. But people lost all sight of the historical critiques of the limits of reformism, the limits of social democracy, the nature of state power, the nature of capitalist crisis, the nature of class. And then a key fundamental problem remains with Labour, the Labour left and so forth, is the disconnect from the class. The disconnect from the working class in the broader sense. Most of the Labour parties have membership. Well, it's a mixed bag, but certainly the ones that end up in the upper echelons of the party come from more middle class backgrounds, private school education, various sort of things. And it's just a different worldview if you come from that background. And that's why the reason the working class is given the central role in socialism and in Marxism isn't because of some moralistic idea. It's because of the objective role they play within capitalist society. They're the only ones that have nothing to lose, and they're the ones who have the power to actually change things. And so the working class and the idea of class and class power and the capacity of the working class to transform society has to be the central focus. And it just hasn't been. We've got variations on what you'd call sort of well-meaning liberal Fabianism. There's sort of different people who, again, very well-intentioned, very, very sort of committed people, draft policies on what a new healthcare system might look like, and then say, this is what we're going to do for you. But that's not how it works. You have to empower people and make them the agents in the transformation of society. And that's part of your process of political education. And that just hasn't happened. It hasn't even begun to happen over here. So that's part of what we need to start looking at if we're building power seriously going forward.
That's perfect. Can you just take a few minutes in conclusion? You're somebody, fit this in. I mean, you not only, I think and I regret this. I read you, I took it in. But I just sort of from across the Atlantic accepted the political capitulation of Corbyn and McDonnell to Brexit to Remain forces, I should say. Now, you were undeniably correct on the politics, and this is one of those things that I think and whatever we all we want people to be shifting and reformulating, but I do want to note it's something that several months ago was very controversial terrain for you to take out. Now everybody just sort of accepts it. And it should be noted that you were correct early, not just as a question of ego, but as a question of pointing to the quality of your analysis and seeing. So we all see that fight, maybe you protected some Lib Dem votes in London, but you consolidated the loss of the heartland of Labour, particularly with a very savvy campaign that Boris Johnson ran, which I think is another conversation for another day. But you also supported Brexit actually on the merits, a sort of left Brexit position. With that in mind, what is Corona doing to the European project? And I guess with the paradox that through you and others, I've become much more critical, and I've kind of let go of some of my sort of American delusions about the Europeans, and what they did to Greece really helped. And at the same time, I don't fetishize a return to closed nationalism. I mean, this is precisely a moment for deep grounded internationalism. So how do you kind of put those things together to read what's happening in Europe at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is that absolutely. I mean, I should say 15, maybe 20 years ago, if this issue had come up, my view would have been stay in and change the European Union. But 10, 15 more years of professionally, through what I teach law and I research and work in that area, and then also politically through various things that I've been engaged in, coming to understand the reality of the actually existing European Union as opposed to the sort of idealized version of it, that it is a fundamental fetter, both short term in Syriza was the obvious example of that, and also longer term. If we had got a Corbyn-led left government elected in Britain and we're still in the European Union, they wouldn't have been neutral on any even modest program of redistribution, of nationalisation, and so forth. So for me, the socialist arguments for leaving the European Union are sort of incontrovertible in that sense, and I think that's been one of the. It's a really crucial point. And again, I've said it to someone recently that Brexit for people on the left, so Brexit for socialists and people who consider themselves socialists and Marxists, anarchists, whatever it might be, wasn't really fundamentally about staying in or leaving the European Union. It was a litmus test of the level of analysis, and most of the left failed in that sense, right? Because basically, most of the left, rather than engaging in serious socialist or Marxist analysis, devolved into liberal analysis and basically went, well, Brexit has been called by a racist right-wing government and it's supported by racists, and so it's a racist thing and therefore we must oppose it. And it's absolutely undeniable that racism and anti-migrant sentiment and so forth was a part of the sort of surface level of the Brexit conjuncture, in the same way in which sort of nativist racism was part of Trump's victory in the US. But if all you're looking at is the surface, then you're not doing socialist or Marxist politics. If you don't understand Brexit as part of a sort of structural crisis of the capitalist system, which has been unfolding, not just since 2008, but actually since sort of early 70s, which the current EU was a reaction to. The current EU and the single market and so forth was a reaction to the crises of the 70s in an attempt to overcome that and locked in the gains of neoliberalism. And the failure of most of the British left, with some honourable exceptions in the RMT trade union, for example, one of the most militant trade unions in the UK, they had a socialist leave position from the outset, and a few others did as well. But the failure to understand that speaks to a couple of things. It speaks to analytical sort of failure and a failure to properly grasp it in a socialist and a Marxist way, but also, again, to this disconnect from the class. Because if you had been embedded, if the Labour Party had been embedded properly in working class communities, and this isn't just, sometimes people simplistically try to draw a distinction between northern working class here in the UK and the sort of southern metropolitan, whatever it is. I lived in London until very recently. I lived in a very sort of diverse community in North London, mostly Kurdish and Turkish, very working class and so forth. Nobody there cared about a second referendum on Brexit. They were concerned with the sort of cost of transport, the cost of accommodation in London. They were fighting over the attempts to demolish schools in the area. They were concerned with cuts to the healthcare sector. They were concerned with bread and butter stuff. The second vote, people's voting, was a middle class movement. It was a middle class campaign. These are the sort of people whose politics was formed during the sort of halcyon days of the credit fueled bubble of the last 15 years and the rising house prices and rising asset prices. People who want the restoration, the same sort of people who would like Hillary Clinton to be president, who want things just to go back to the way they were when it was sort of endless spending on credit cards and there was no sort of problems on the horizon. And that wasn't something that a socialist movement could tap into. That's not something that a socialist movement could channel and work with. And that also wasn't something a socialist movement should want to. So there was the principled socialist case for leaving the European Union, and then there was also pragmatic political arguments. Because again, I campaigned in the last election. I'm not actually, just on the sort of introduction, I'm not in Labour. I supported Corbyn. I work with people in Labour, but I'm not in Labour because it's not really for me in terms of what it's about fundamentally. But I did support a campaign in the last election for some fantastic candidates, in particular Laura Smith and crew, who unfortunately lost their seat. But if you went out there, you saw the anger straight away. You knocked on people's doors and you were walking in there and saying, we're going to give you free broadband. We're going to nationalise the education system. We're going to do a whole range of these radical changes. That one thing you've had a choice on, that one policy issue that you've been given a choice on the last 40 years, we're not going to do that. And we've got this sort of half-arsed way of saying we're going to have a second referendum in which Corbyn will stay neutral. So, and
it always struck me that when you'd watch Tony Blair talk about the European Union, and I have my, whatever. I have my own issues I have to work out with Tony Blair. I should hate him more. I do hate him, but I should hate him more. But you could watch Tony Blair, and from the perspective of a right-wing, 90s style neoliberal who was looking at Europe maintaining relevance in a G2 world, his arguments made a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And then McConnell and Corbyn, who are obviously, better people in every shape and form with an actual vision for society and internationalism, when they would say it, they just sounded like, hey, I'm a socialist, but I've read a couple of FT columns and it would be really bad. It just doesn't sound compelling.
It does. That's actually one of the crucial things. I mean, again, it will remain to be seen what happens in the US election in due course. I don't hold out much hope of sort of the weekend that Bernie's candidate defeating Trump. So I don't sort of see that happening. But this is the thing about the politics we're in now and the conjuncture we're in now. There's a fundamental structural crisis in the system. And again, it's been unfolding for quite a long period of time, but particularly since 2008, it's been acute. And the thing is that this is why Corbyn and Brexit are so intimately related. The Brexit vote, the Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. It was unforeseen. It was a sort of historical accident. The Brexit vote happened, and the subsequent general election 2007 was the biggest increase in Labour's vote since World War II, delivered by Corbyn, making it an offer of change, effectively an offer of sort of, we call it socialism, but basically soft social democracy. And those two things are so intimately linked because both of them reflected a desire and an attempt to grasp an alternative to the status quo. The problem was when the last election came around, Labour had been co-opted into a restoration of the status quo ante. Labour then had effectively become the party that was saying we're going to undo Brexit, but they wouldn't even say it honestly, which made it worse, because one of the things that made Corbyn such a compelling figure was his honesty and his authenticity. And he's somebody who was arrested protesting against apartheid in the 70s and 80s, who's been consistent on these issues. And suddenly in the last election, he's doing interviews on TV where he says, we'll have another referendum. If we win the election, we'll have another referendum and I'll remain neutral on it. And people are looking at it going, well, hang on, you're just another one of them. You're just another one of these lawyers. And on the other hand, you have this absolute sort of charlatan in Boris Johnson, sort of dripping privilege from every pore, but he gets to spin himself as the insurgent outsider candidate, the one who's opposing all of these people who are trying to stop Brexit and everything else. And it was a clear-cut Brexit election, and Labour tried to make it about everything except Brexit, and that was never going to happen. I mean, again, it's one of those things that the left campaign, which I'm involved with, we supported Labour in the election and so forth, but we'd prepared our analysis of the outcome of the election a week and a half in advance of any actual results because it was clear how it was going. The actual aggregate numbers in terms of the Conservative Party lead didn't really change throughout the course of the election. Some polls put them much further ahead, some polls put them a little closer, but the aggregate numbers, it remained between sort of 8% and 6% Conservative Labour at all points throughout the election. And that's another thing then, is that the soft left in the UK during the election was caught up in the sort of delusions of the moment that we're going to win this, the vote will go higher. But objectively, that was just never the case. And again, you had to be, this goes back to Cabral. I'm far too strict a Cabralist for my own good sometimes, is that you can't bullshit people. You can't tell people we're going to win. And this is sometimes, you'll often see people invoke Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? Optimism of the will and willful optimism are two very different things. The optimism of the will means getting up and going, this is an absolutely horrendous situation. We've got all these different factors against us. But if we understand the sort of imminent tendencies within the system, if we understand the role that the working class can play in transforming this, there are ways we can turn this around. There are pressure points we can put on. It doesn't mean looking at a situation and then sort of Peter Pan, like wishing enough in order to change it. It means actually sort of understanding the system and then working to turn it around. And the problem we've had here, when you go back to the EU, so the whole thing question of the EU, most of the British left didn't grasp what was going on. They got caught up in liberal moralism about racism and so forth and sort of dropped the ball completely. And that's also because the membership of a lot of the left groups isn't embedded in the working class community. Because again, if you were properly and strongly rooted in working class communities, when somebody came along and said, you know what, instead of respecting the vote like we said we'd do in 2017, we should actually come out now and say we're going to go for a second vote, they'd be laughed out of the room. But because it wasn't that, it was sort of professional pollsters and so forth in a room compiling data and saying, oh, well, we could possibly get this seat and possibly get that seat. And it became crass sort of electoralism without any serious vision. But in terms of what Corona's done to the EU, So for the last few years, as the Brexit debate has dragged on here, I've been involved in a number of discussions, and in almost all of them, I said to people that I'd be very surprised if the EU survives as it's currently constituted when the next crisis hits. So the last crisis of 2008 and the Eurozone crisis and the treatment of Greece, of Spain, of Portugal, of Italy, of Ireland really exposed the contradictions at the heart of the EU, the sort of core periphery divergence, the sort of inequality between states, the inequality of power and so forth. And it was very unlikely that when the next crisis hit, that those institutions would survive. And we've seen just in the last few days, Corona has hit. It's unprecedented. So it's not. I'm sure you've heard or read Rob Wallace's work on the coronavirus and so forth. And if anybody's looking to get a sort of serious grasp on what's going on, Rob Wallace's work is excellent. So the fact that the crisis wasn't unanticipated, the nature of this particular crisis is surprising in terms of how it turned up in the form of this virus and so forth, and unprecedented in that sense. And the cost of it in terms of what it's doing to the economies. You've seen some of the headline figures sort of from Wall Street, the sort of loss of 27% of value in the second quarter. The UK economy due to contract by 35% this year. One estimate that the EU states collectively will need to spend 1.5 trillion just this year in order to keep things on track. Now, one response to that is the states in the EU, Italy in particular, France also even, who have suffered over the last 10 years with austerity imposed by the EU and who are in a weak position financially and economically, asked, playing back this language of European solidarity and so forth, asked the burden of meeting the coronavirus crisis be shared amongst the member states. They were pushing the idea of corona bonds so that basically it would allow all of the member states of the EU to pool their resources and to an extent pool their liabilities, which would allow these governments in the poorer countries to borrow at lower interest rates and to not worry about massive debts on the other side of the crisis. Well, that was shot down straight away by the Dutch and crucially by the Germans. There was a meeting just a few days ago where this was effectively rejected. They've announced a package of 500 billion, but most of that 500 billion will be in the form of loans or grants, which of course will have to be paid back. So it will be a perpetuation of the austerity cycle within the EU, which again reinforces the socialist arguments against the European Union. Because again, the great delusion of people like Yanis Varoufakis and many on the British left was that you should remain in and reform the European Union. And again, it's not something I'd say lightly. If I thought we could reform the European Union, I'd argue for staying in and doing so. But structurally and constitutionally, it's designed to be beyond any meaningful reform. It's designed to be beyond democratic control and accountability. And also because of the political economy of European integration, the trajectory of it. Again, it's always been the case that the EU is going to get increasingly neoliberal. I think neoliberal is the wrong word, but increasingly authoritarian and increasingly putting pressure on these peripheral states to privatize further sectors of the economy, to pay off debts that are sort of unsustainable and so forth. So the coronavirus has again exposed the character of the European Union, the absolute delusion of the idea of European solidarity, and it hasn't vindicated Brexit. Brexit, again, one of the things about Brexit is that Brexit is a process, and that's been one of the problems for people as well. There's a lot of talk about a cliff edge and falling off and everything else, but Brexit isn't an event. It isn't something that happens on a day. It's a process. And again, the Left campaign, which I work with, we were set up, and the whole argument we were making from the start was that the fight isn't about whether we leave or not. That should be settled and should have been settled. And part of what we tried to do was fight a rearguard action against Labour taking the disastrous decision to back a second referendum. But the real fight has always been about what will Britain look like going forward. But to go back to your point then about not retreating into nationalism, probably guess from the accent I'm not British, and I'm certainly not a British nationalist. So my support for Brexit doesn't come from that perspective.
No
but
way.
On that point, there's an important thing that, and I wrote a small article for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Trademark Belfast on this, because sections of the British, effectively the sort of the right of the Labour Party and so forth, were painting themselves as internationalists, and that's why we have to stay in the European Union. But it's important then that we contest this. It's important that we say that what you get with the EU isn't internationalism. You get a truncated cosmopolitanism that benefits capital and doesn't benefit workers, doesn't benefit migrants, doesn't benefit the countries of the global south who the EU is pillaging through sort of bilateral trade agreements and so forth. So it's not the internationalism of the working class. And then ironically, or not ironically actually, but without wanting to get too sort of clunky, but like dialectically, that actually rupturing with the EU, which ostensibly looks like a retreat to nationalism, is actually a precondition for advancing internationalism. So it's not the surface level stuff again, it's more complex, and we had to do that. But then also in the UK, a lot of that argument was scuppered and scuttled because the decision was taken. I mean, that was one of the key things as well, the democratic argument. Once the vote was taken, and it was a close vote, but once that decision was taken, for Labour to allow itself to become the party of frustrating the single biggest democratic exercise in British history, while also claiming to be the party of fundamental transformation, it just didn't stack up, and it involved a certain level of sort of bubble thinking to be able to get to that point.
Paul O'Connell, I always appreciate your time so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Just learned so much, and I can't wait to talk to you again soon.
Thanks again. So take care. All right. Be safe.
Take care. Be safe.
Bye.
Get good rest. Take care. All right, folks. You guys there? Matt and David?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. So what we're going to do now is the gem, and then we're going to play this brand new interview that we just recorded just the other day with Slavoj Zizek, and then we'll come back. That's a little over 30 minutes, and then we'll go to the post game. All right. But now it's gem time. Yeah, that's another guy I feel like could be grading the gems right there.
I like Paul. That was really great, actually.
Paul is brilliant. It's only hitters now from TMBS. I will say people will learn this in the post game, but next Tuesday, insanely excited about the guest we're getting on. Insanely excited.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah. So
You're good to go?
Yeah, I'm good. So there's obviously a lot going on right now. We are living in a completely new world, and we don't know what's going to come on the other side of this kind of, COVID capitalism and the economic collapse. But I want to talk about a couple of things that are very important that have been going on that have been sort of pushed to the back. The first has been what's been going on with oil. Basically, in the middle of this pandemic, just right as it was starting to really hit Europe and the United States, Saudi Arabia basically started a price war with the rest of the oil-producing nations. And it completely plummeted the price of oil for everyone. And specifically Saudi Arabia and Russia were in this huge conflict about how much oil they were going to be producing. So I bring this up because Donald Trump has surprisingly stepped in and has negotiated this massive new agreement with the majority of the oil-producing nations. And it's been very interesting to see what happens. First of all, just recently, the deal was announced on Sunday, and just today, oil actually dropped below $20 a barrel, which is historically low. And low oil prices mean that it's not very profitable to drill, and it means that the many people who are employed in the oil industry, they face layoffs and things like that. So it's very significant, even though we want to push for a post-carbon future. This is a significant part of the global economy. So basically what happened in this agreement was the majority of countries at OPEC, what they're calling OPEC Plus, have now agreed to drastically cut the amount of oil that they're producing. They're going to be cutting around 9.7 million barrels a day of oil production, which is massive. It's the largest oil output cut ever in history. And it's been very interesting to see how that has happened on the geopolitical level, and also specifically what it means for the U.S.-Saudi relations.
David, just real quick, because so just to be really clear, you might think superficially, because like from a U.S. consumer perspective, I guess it doesn't really make a difference now because people are there's less energy consumption, but lower oil prices means you can fill your tank up for less. So that's a good thing. Trump is concerned, though, because if the glut that was produced by overproduction and the Saudi play not only could lead to layoffs, but it can undermine the U.S. shale market and U.S. domestic production. So that's what he's really concerned about.
That's
right?
100%. And it seems very clear that those are the people who are calling the shots behind the scenes. So the geopolitical note that I wanted to mention was that the United States, basically, the United States senators from this was reported in the Financial Times, senators from the major oil producing states in the U.S. were on the phone with the Saudis. And they threatened that if the Saudi Arabians do not come to the table and dramatically shift their practices, that the United States is going to reevaluate their entire relationship with Saudi Arabia. So this has basically been a massive geopolitical story that has been, very much on the back burner, obviously because of what we're facing. But it's just another thing that's happening at the worst possible time for the global economy. So that's happening. And then JP Morgan and Wells Fargo just released their recent quarter reports. JP Morgan reported that they had lost 69% of their net income. Wells Fargo, 89%. The IMF came out today and they said their outlook for the next few months is the worst outlook since the 1930s. The IMF estimates that economies across the globe, they're going to see their economies shrink by 5%. And for countries in the advanced capitalist countries, around 6.1%. So we're seeing a squeeze on oil and we're seeing a squeeze on finance capital happening at a time when, because of policies, for example, by the Obama administration and by the flawed recovery that we have an entire economy based on corporations that are very much like the WeWork model, right? Where there's a bunch of nonsense saying that they're a tech company, but fundamentally they're a real estate company with very shaky path to profitability. WeWork just announced that to their workers that there's likely going to be many layoffs in the near future. So we're going to see a squeeze on finance, and we're also seeing a squeeze on business, and a lot of business that has been on very shaky ground for a very long time. They're holding massive amounts of debts. They're holding investments that don't seem like they're going to pan out, and their business models are fundamentally unprofitable. Now, what does this mean for us? It means that the federal government and the international community understand that a lot of coordination is going to be needed to be done in the near future. But this coordination is not necessarily going to be something that's going to be beneficial for working class Americans or working class people. And there has been no fundamental shift in the conception of what has led to this crisis, right? Obviously, coronavirus and the COVID crisis created the crisis where people had to start looking at their balance sheets. So these massive corporations that are holding a lot of unprofitable investments were participating in kind of wasteful activities, and we're just holding lots of debt. Now we're having to look at their balance sheet. But that kind of toxic behavior has been developed over the past few decades. The just-in-time production models have been developed over a period of time when stability and even long-term profitability were not on anyone's mind. It was always about making as much short-term profit as you can in an environment that was encouraged by the United States by keeping the price of money very cheap. So look, we're going to see a bunch of nonsense from the federal government, but something that is not going to happen unless we start demanding it is going to be a fundamental shift in our economic relationships. And that's what fundamentally matters. These people, you should read some of the op-eds that are going in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg recently. People think that this is going to be a short little blip and this is a huge opportunity, right? They do not recognize that across the board, this kind of capitalism on steroids that has sprinted into the most speculative aspects of the economy, basically finance, that all this movement in our economic system towards that part of the economic pie, the economic community, means that these crises are going to hit much harder, and they're going to continue to grow exponentially unless we fundamentally change the dynamics of our relationship to finance capital and our addiction to cheap money. So I just wanted to put out a couple things real quick on a hopeful level, that like, what could we do if we were in a situation where we had a kind of progressive government, progressive coalition? Fundamentally, what are we going to need to do after this crisis? We're going to need to get people to work. So many people who've been working in precarious jobs, because this economy created precarious jobs, because that was the only place to put the majority of people, so that you could still have consumers while still maintaining the power dynamic of a few people owning everything in society. People are going to need to work. We need a federal jobs guarantee for sure. We need to be mobilizing people on a massive scale, because once this crisis is over and we're all able to get out of quarantine, there's going to be a lot of people who don't have jobs, and they do not have any access to the capital markets, which is the only thing that they're going to be propping up. Two, if we had a progressive government, we could be taking over the oil and gas corporations. Now, I know we're not in a situation like that, but it's important for us to start thinking about what would we do if we were in power. And three, there's going to need to be a lot of bailouts, and there are going to be a lot of bankruptcies in the near future. The federal government should come in, and they say they will buy these companies out, and they will give the companies, they will create an entity that allows those companies to then be owned by their own workers. Right now, I don't think that Donald Trump is going to do that. He might put in a federal jobs program, and it's going to be our responsibility to make sure that that's a progressive program, because what are they going to try to do? They're going to try to turn that into workfare. They're going to try to say, if you don't work in the federal jobs program, that you don't have access to fundamental benefits. So we need to do two things at once, right? We need to recognize the reality of the current situation, and we also need to be able to understand what we would be doing if we were in power, because there's going to be a lot of bold and massive changes in the near future, because the system is on the brink of collapse, and we need to make sure that we're at least thinking in the correct way to prepare to come up with solutions and then the ways to implement those.
Absolutely. That's really important. We're going to do more coverage on those oil and OPEC stories. And in general, it's just so important. And thank you, David. This is another part of the incredible quality of this show. Really, don't be intimidated by economics, because it's nothing to be intimidated by. Mm-hmm. But it's very important. If folks on the left spent a hell of a lot more time reading the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, we would be much better off. So it's really important to have a fluency in this stuff, because this is how things actually work. All right, folks, let me just say again, if you're watching this and you haven't yet, smash the like button, hit us with a super chat donation. It keeps everything moving along. And guys, we still have the goal and we still have the focus. We got to hit 4,000 patrons. We do an incredible amount of work. The weekly main show that we do every week of over 2 hours, and then obviously the post game, it's usually over 4 hours. But is a huge amount of work, and there's a lot of attention put into it, and then obviously all the other shows that we do. So it's really important to keep growing it, keep sustaining it. Obviously, look, we're fine if you're in a position where you can't. Zero problem. Throw us a like, subscribe on iTunes, whatever. Write us a review on iTunes. Throw us a like. Spread the word. This is all great. If you can, though. Maybe you just stopped your monthly donation to Bernie. It's time to patron up to TMBS. This is actually a piece of the puzzle here. Check out my new show on Saturdays on the Jacobin with Anna Kasparian, weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks, and other projects I'll be doing with Jacobin, and everything else. But now we're going to play this interview with Slavoj Zizek. It's about 30 minutes. I'm really excited about it. And then we're going to go to the post game. Just keep powering through. So guys, how are we going to do this? Matt?
Matt?
Quick break, and we're going to go live with Žižek. So are we leaving this meeting? Okay. All right, folks. Okay, cool. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is friend of show and a person that I have no doubt that who he is. He's author most recently of a collection of essays which you can get as an ebook through Or Books called Pandemic. COVID-19 Shakes the World. Slavoj Zizek, thank you for joining us over this questionable technology from Slovenia to Brooklyn.
Thanks very much. You know what happened with this technology in Singapore? It's
yes, go tell us.
Joke in this. They used it for teaching in elementary schools, but somebody hacked it and put pornographic images into it, so they prohibited it.
Oh, that's not just Singapore. That is happening everywhere. Oh my God, yes, absolutely. It's the chat roulette days are back. Slavoj, what about, let's just talk very broadly first. You have been someone who's always focused a lot on the commons, which I think is very important in terms of understanding where we are. When you look at the bailouts and the sort of consolidations that are coming, particularly in the United States, what do you see as the long-term economic consequences of the pandemic?
Well, things are, in very sad sense, pretty ironic now. Conservative politicians are doing things which, if left democratic politicians were to do it, he would be accused of introducing communism or whatever, and so on and so on. Boris Johnson temporarily nationalized the British railways. Trump is now invoking that Cold War law which allows him to give direction to run industry and so on, all that stuff. So obviously, as even such a guy who he admits it, he admires capitalism, like Bill Gates, he wrote in a recent short comment that obviously markets cannot do the job. You need a whole set of measures which, and I don't use this, what I will say now, for praising communism and so on. We will enter, if you ask me, and again, I'm not glad about it, it will be a sad period. A period of, unfortunately, what I cannot call but wartime communism, more communism of misery. What do I mean by this? Isn't it clear that in order for our societies to more or less survive in an orderly way, you have to take care, or the state together with people and so on, you have to guarantee that some basic things will function. Not only healthcare for all, and even Bill Gates admits it here. Healthcare must be global healthcare. You cannot have United States relatively safe and across the border pandemics and so on. We need some kind of not only a universal healthcare within singular state, but some kind of global healthcare system which coordinates the efforts and so on. This means scientific research, collaboration. This means a coordination of who is producing respirators, masks, all that stuff and so on. But this is not all. Next thing, now, and this is almost a touching, I almost cried Marxist moment for me, how we became aware of how false the formula lockdown is. Are we aware how many people whom we simply didn't notice have to go on working so that we can be, nobody is really safe, relatively safe in our isolated apartments. Food delivery, electricity, trash, not to some healthcare and so on. So it's lockdown is an option for a privileged minority. Look at the situation in India, where they tried to do a lockdown and it turned ridicule. Because what about, we are talking, I read, about millions of people who simply in big cities like Mumbai, New Delhi, didn't even have a home. They simply were selling something on the street, they were sleeping there in a corner. So what does it mean, go home for them? Not to mention, of course, all the millions of refugees, all about Middle East and at other places. They cannot self-isolate, they don't have a place where to isolate and so on. So this is the first thing. This is now, and here markets cannot do the job. We cannot say, oh, do we have enough money for this? No, we have to think in different terms. Our societies are developed enough to produce healthcare equipment, enough food, and so on, but we will have to organize it. And I don't know how this will work in the United States. In Europe, since spring is here, there is already in most of European states, developed states, Germany, France, even in my state, Slovenia, a big problem. Spring harvest is approaching. we were all relying on immigrant guest workers from other less developed parts, like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people from Spain and southern Italy came to France and so on. Now, because there is a lockdown, they cannot do it. How to do it? Up to a point, you can do it with volunteers. But food provision is crucial. Who knows? Maybe some kind of almost wartime mobilization will be needed. Young people who are now unemployed and so on will have to be literally mobilized. So, and then another thing, this is one of the few bright spots, what people from Latin America, from Spain, and even from southern Italy, my links there are telling me, how all those organizations that we usually like to dismiss as simply crime organizations proved quite efficient. For example, do you know in Sicily who is now distributing freely food to the poor? Of course, probably with their own calculation. It's mafia. Yep. And the most beautiful thing, it almost made me cry. You know, a friend from Rio de Janeiro wrote to me, you know, in favelas there, gangs who are usually fighting for the territory, they concluded peace and are organizing help for destitute lone people there, and so on and so on. So my point is what? My point is now almost everybody is, that's my irony, not even a socialist, but almost a communist. They admit it. We need international cooperation, real cooperation, because again, you cannot have one side of the border epidemics, the other side is safe. We need efficient state which, if necessary, breaks all the rules of the market and so on, just to deliver. These are matters of survival. And in Spain, I was told, there were beautiful moments how in local communities, people self-organized, you know. It's almost like, I think, in Cuba, and I'm not a believer in Castro, but they still have these, how do they call them, local committees of revolution, which take care of the law. Now they're re-emerging in Italian, Spanish cities, but in a positive way. People simply ask, okay, who are the old people who live alone in our block? What can we do for them? And so on and so on. But I, on the other hand, it's a dangerous moment. Every politician is already saying.
Zizek, I want to, Slavoj, real quick, I want to just inject two things into this that are important.
I'm very sorry. You have full right to interrupt me. I talk too much, yes?
We love you talking, and I have a full right to interrupt. So it's a dialectic. So
Comrade Stalin would be proud of you.
This is the highest praise of Stalin through you. But this also reminds me of this book that came out called The People's Republic of Walmart, how the world's largest corporation are laying the foundation of socialism. And this is actually something I want you to expand on first. The idea that in the complexity and the centralization of those supply chains that you see at something like Walmart, actually debunks the idea that like, oh, no, it could never be that central. It could never work like that. It needs to be kind of more horizontal and so on. It shows that in certain ways you can plan like that, but it's not being planned in a democratic direction. It's being planned in the Walmart direction, which loops back to your point. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely agree with you. And I'm well aware how dangerous also the situation is for new forms of corruption here.
Yes.
I don't blame capitalists as persons, but such a situation solicits corruption. So I'm here very realist. I am for these necessary communist measures. By communist measures, don't be afraid. I don't mean Central Committee will run United States, but I mean almost, and this is a cruel irony in what I'm saying now. I mean almost what Trump is doing now, and Trump is not my, when he says we need so many respirators, masks, and so on, giving orders to industry. But this has to be done in a transparent way, you know, which is my formula. When a journalist asks me what kind of a communism I imagine, and I answered him, communism with Julian Assange. Like somebody like Assange, yes. This is what China is missing. I'm not pro-Chinese. And now I will tell you something for which now many people who thought I'm now praising China, total control, they did it. No. There are good reasons that if the Chinese wouldn't miss at the very beginning of December, the first weeks, it would just have remained a local epidemic there. Second,
No, but real quick, I mean, I want to tease that out though, because how do you connect that Trump is bullshitting a lot of this? So like he says we should do defense production, but he's not actually doing it. He's letting them price gouge. Where is the gap between the rhetoric, which Trump actually does very well at times, but it's not getting implemented as one lane? Then there's the other, and maybe we could connect this with China. You've warned us, and we've talked before about the idea of the Singapore world, that everywhere will kind of turn into a kind of platform surveilled capitalism. And then the third thing that you're talking about, which is maybe this opening to reject the market logic. Do you see those three? I see those three horizons. I see the Trump bullshit artistry, and we're price gouging and we're doing Reaganism here, which is why it's such a disaster. Then I see people being drawn to an authoritarian narrative that has efficacy. So China is very complicated, and I think we need to critique where China has clearly failed and not been transparent. And then on the other hand, they're building hospitals in a matter of days. The world is going to look at that with a lot of admiration. But and then is there a social response?
Yeah, but I will give you now why, as if, now I will sound horrible, some leftists will lynch me for saying this, but why, as if the alternative is China or Trump? Let's look at, Singapore made a mistake because they opened up too fast. Now it's growing a little bit, but it's sad to say this, but the countries which did it correctly, I think are, and that's why China doesn't want them mentioned, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea.
South Korea,
they did it. I don't know. I don't want to be a racist. Is it their tradition of social discipline and so on? But look at Hong Kong. The ferocious demonstrations that went on for months, for half a year before the epidemics, prove that they certainly are not in their nature totalitarian, but nonetheless, they did it in an organized way. So Korea, look at Korea and so on. Look at Taiwan. So it can be done, but the basic thing is here also now I will say something sad for some of the leftists. We from the left should, this is the motive I always repeat, we from the left we need an efficient state now. No, we should maybe not becoming obsessed with this Giorgio Agamben motive, those in power will use this as a tool of new totalitarian control. Probably they will try, but you know what is my main counter argument? And those in power are aware of it. It's not we ordinary people who are terrorized by them. They are in a panic. They don't know how to solve it. They are under test. What I fear almost more is that the people that the people's trust into authority will be undermined. But we need now some kind of functioning government authority which people trust at least minimally. And from what I hear in the United States, it's not as simple as that. Trump talks a lot, but things are happening at different level. Governors in some states try to be more efficient and so on and so on. So now we can see how Trump is not an efficient central leader. No, he talks too much. He is not enough of an efficient leader.
Well, that's an interesting. Right, but so let's tease that out. So there's the fact that governments will use this in new authoritarian directions, that's a policy concern. That's a big, I mean, in the United States.
Sorry to interrupt you, but it's crucial to remember that they are also in a panic. And
absolutely. And they are in a panic. No question. Now. And then the next two things that are interesting.
People can tell them, listen, you gave us orders. We self-isolate, blah, blah, blah. Now show us the results.
Well, that's the point I wanted to make, which is that now. Yeah. So in the middle of that, there's definitely, of course, I mean, this reasserts the importance of state power, state action, and enough buy-in from the public to support that, which you have in South Korea as an example. In the United States, it goes state by state, but you have many places where you could not try, you know, if the governor of Florida is keeping the beaches open, or Andrew Cuomo is trying to cut Medicaid in the middle of a pandemic, which he is, that leads people to have the paradox of the leaders are terrified. We need a government efficiency now, but we cannot have buy-in because the response is a failure.
Yeah, and that's the danger. I don't know if it is true also for the state of New York, but Friends for California are telling me that when people began to shop like crazy in the first moments of panic, even before pharmacies were emptied, it was gun stores, which in California were empty.
All across. Yes.
All across. Yeah. And I think, you see, this is madness, because just try to think, what is the secret scenario? What situation do they fear? They have seen probably too many Hollywood movies or what, and they think of the epidemics in these old categories of crazy infected zombies attacking your house. You need enough guns to protect it. It doesn't work like that. The second thing that I worry about is, again, the long-term economic consequences. For example, as I said, we will need really some measures of, I hope it will not be as bad as it was in the old times of communism, wartime communism. By this, I mean the state has the right, if necessary, to mobilize people, to distribute food, and so on and so on. I think this can be done if there is enough trust between people and state apparatuses. This can be done even in an enthusiastic way. For example, okay, don't mention to me Boris Johnson. He screwed it up. That's why England will have more debt than Spain and Italy. But nonetheless, it was a nice moment when they appealed to young people to offer their services as volunteers. Instantly, around 500,000 people volunteered.
Yes.
And once you trigger this is my hope. It will be a poor time. I'm not talking now we will have communism in this emphatic leftist sense, society of affluence, and so on and so on. I'm just saying, my God, what Bill Gates is saying. Markets cannot do the job here. And even the state, with only more authoritarian measures, cannot do it. Because then people will react, not take it seriously, and so on and so on. It's measures which I, in my crazy jargon, designate as potentially communist. I don't mean any 19th century dream. I simply mean the state power cannot rule alone. It has to rely on the local self-organization in parts of the city, and so on and so on. As I said, the examples of Spain, in Madrid, I was told this works. Second thing, the state has to, in some way, Bill Gates says this, directly impose measures on economy, regulate economy, and so on. Still, some competition maybe is needed here to prevent corruption and so on. And I cannot emphasize this enough, international cooperation, which has to be raised at a new level. And here even Europe is disappointing me. I don't know how it is in other parts, but European Union didn't succeed in imposing an order. It's just one state trying to snatch half still provisions from another state. Like, for example, it happened already a couple of times, this scandal in Europe. One big state, I don't know, France or Germany, bought 10 million masks from a Chinese company. Then they learned, oh, the other state, I don't know which one, offered more money and so on. This chaos. This
is what happened in state to state in the United States.
Sorry, another thing which is important. It is very sad news, although not catastrophic. Most of us, large majority, will survive and so on. But, you know, two things are unfortunately becoming clear. The first one is that you remember those dreams we were dreaming a month or two ago. Oh, this is just a winter thing with spring heat, it will disappear. Well, right. It doesn't quite look that way. It will last. It's not a matter of, oh, be patient a little bit, in August you will take a holiday already. No, probably there will be, and again, it's a danger of authoritarian temptation here. Probably we will have to get classified, like people like me. I'm 71 with diabetes and so on. You stay isolated as long as possible. Others and so on can do it. What interests me, because you know what's the tragedy of what you mentioned, exit strategy. The tragedy is that we don't know enough to plan it, and we are de facto making experiments. For example, in Europe, all our eyes are now turned towards Sweden because they opted not for total closure. Restaurants, schools still work. It looked bad. Now it doesn't look so bad. Numbers of death, the number of those who die are falling, and so on and so on. But again, you cannot trust all these official statistics. So again, my crazy formula, communism with Julian Assange.
I love it.
Yeah.
Real quick, Slavoj, just in the last couple of minutes. I like this idea of communism with Julian Assange. I also want to say, and we've covered this on the show, the United States has this is the most despicable thing I've seen, has actually gone and sent out ships to intervene and take a philanthropist was sending a handful of oxygen masks to Barbados. A U.S. ship blocked it, took it back to the United States. So there are these anti-international obscenities taking place. But as a lesson for the left, and just take a minute or two and then we'll wrap up, but I really think this is important. The habit that we have is to always go to a place of defeat or hopelessness. This is a terrible psychology of having the possibility to win, frankly. So when you talk about recognizing that those in power are panicked and terrified, what is the psychological payoff for us to not see that and maybe change our habits around recognizing that we aren't just the ones that are panicked. We aren't just the ones that are on the receiving end. There's possibility outside for those who want to move in a left direction as well. Does that make sense?
Here, okay, yes. I think it has to be done in a mutual way. Those in power have to realize that they cannot do it without us people trusting them, and vice versa, and so on. It's clear from the successful cases, like relatively successful, like South Korea, Taiwan, Norway up to a point, New Zealand. New Zealand, for example, there is a tremendous amount of trust between, let's say, government and ordinary people. But can I briefly conclude with a story that I think brings together the danger? It's an old story, pseudo-Oriental, quoted by the British playwright and writer Somerset Maugham. You maybe know it. There is a John O'Hara novel, Appointment in Samara. An ordinary servant encounters on a market in Samara Death. And Death looks at him, shocked. And the guy runs away to his master and says, Dad wanted to kill me on the market. Please, I want to escape to Samara, ride all the night, and blah, blah, blah. And then the angry boss of that servant goes to the market and asks Dad, why did you frighten? Why do you want to kill my servant? And the Dad answers, you know what? No, my gaze was not was not anger, it was a surprise. Why is he here when tomorrow I have an appointment with him in Samara? The guy escaping, So that's the danger with this opening and so on. It's a horrible situation. If we remain in lockdown for too long, I don't know how it is in the United States, but in my country, all what they consider unnecessary medical exams, they are following how your cancer is being liver, all is postponed. And this will be then, that it's quite possible if this pandemic will not be too heavy, that there will be much more damage at that level. So that, we see death, which is pandemic, we run to Samara, appointment with Samara is then economic consequences then. That's the problem. How to find, and again, there are small signs of hope, New Zealand, Taiwan, and so on, that it can be done. The right, it's a very fragile line of opening. Here, I even agreed, sorry for this obscenities, with Trump, who said that country cannot be eternally into a lockdown. This is typical upper class idea. Lockdown means all those invisible providers still work. Some kind of opening we have to do, but how to do it? And this is the main challenge.
Slavoj Zizek, we really appreciate you. Next time.
I appreciate you. I think in these times, which present themselves as times of permissiveness, democratic opening, and so on, are we aware how the space of a true free debate is more and more limited from the right, from the politically correct left? And I think you, out of the mainstream big media, you are the only ones who are practicing what one of my favorite philosophers, Immanuel Kant, called public use of reason. By this, he didn't mean state as representative of the public. He meant a piece outside institutional control. This is needed more than ever today, not to sow the usual mistrust into state, but precisely to keep the relations transparent, to develop the mutual trust between sides. Because you know what's the problem? Politics remains, sorry, just to conclude an important thing. I agree with Greta science. But scientists themselves, and it's not just that some of them are bribed, scientists themselves are not of one opinion, they are divided. These decisions, do we open? How many lives do we risk if we abolish? And to what degree should we abolish the lockdown and so on? These are not simply scientific decisions. Politics enters here. So I don't agree with those who claim now it's just efficient government and science. No, politics is happening now, as you see in the United States.
Slavoj, can I just sign off and give you a really quick joke? We'll take you 20 seconds and then we'll go. But
Absolutely.
all right, I'm inspired to tell you this joke, and I will tell everybody again, for anybody gets concerned. I have Jewish background, but I love this joke.
Mm-hmm.
A handful of middle-aged Jewish ladies are out for lunch, and the waiter comes in the middle of the meal and he says, "Is anything okay?" This is my favorite right now.
Oh, yeah. So maybe, unfortunately, I hope you had the same thing as me, or I rather don't hope in my mind that that's what we are, that's my attitude when I look at the news. Like, is anything
Exactly.
okay? Is anything good that you hear in the news, And I'm a weak person. Just the last thing, you can cut it. Don't you agree? I hate spiritualists now who are raising their head and said, oh, maybe this crisis will bring us more to our senses, that we will more think about deeper truth of life. No, this crisis is simply something horrible. I mean, I always distrusted this spiritual dismissal of ordinary people. Ordinary people want to have their ordinary fun. There is nothing stupid in it. Horrible things are happening. Don't try to justify them with some shitty spiritual justification.
I have a spiritual life, and I think it's interesting and important, but I actually think to deny how horrible it is negates the possibility of having that conversation in any way. So in other words, that, and it reminds me of liberation theology. I mean, if you don't start in reality, then it's just escapism. Then that's it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So,
Slavoj, thank you
very much.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 Welcome back, Michael Brooks Show. Another epic full show there. And pretty big words from us from Slavoj there, guys. My only dispute would be is I hope we're pre-mainstream. That's the goal. We're not mainstream news yet, but we will work to increase the market share. But no, seriously, that was an honor. And folks, it's time, if you have the ability, to jump on board and become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. We'll get to that 4,000 person goal soon. That is the next target. It's going to facilitate our next projects. If you're new to the show, smash subscribe on YouTube, hit the bell so you get the notifications. And definitely, if you haven't yet, hit the like button. Folks, we're going to take a break. We're going to go to the post-game. Ben Burgess, Joshua Kahn Russell, stories from the Caribbean, Trump's new dictatorial moves, and we will talk about Bernie and Biden, as well as things that are more happy. Peace and love. Appreciate all of you. See you in the post game.